Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cinema Savvy. It is myself, George, joined once more by Reece for a very special video. Not a review, not a discussion, a spoiler discussion. This is the second video in the sort of new series, a deep dive into where we take maybe a classic film, an upcoming film, a recent film, and we take a look at it in a very in-depth way. Something we've only done with Killers of the Flower Moon so far, and how do you follow up a Scorsese banger? We of course get another Denis Villeneuve one, and I'm joined by Reece today to help me talk about this film. But first of all, before we get into maybe what we're going to talk about, other things, Reece, how are you doing today?
Very good, very good. I am enthusiastic about having this conversation about Dune Part 1 and extremely excited to finally watch Dune Part 2 in the coming days and weeks.
Absolutely. Now, at the time of recording, we are recording this on the Monday. It's pre-recorded. I'm going to say to anybody at home, politely put, if you've read the book, please don't do any part two spoilers in case there are people watching who haven't read the second half of the book, because this is, of course, come up before part two. We have a whole plan lined up at the moment for what we're doing with the Dune stuff. There should be an interview coming out on the channel next week. If I'm lucky, there might be some red carpet stuff this Thursday. We have a locked-in spoiler-free review for Wednesday the 21st, probably American time, early hours Thursday for UK people. And there's lots of stuff happening with the channel. There's even going to be a review on the 1984 Dune film, which we'll probably bring up at some point today too. So there's a lot happening. We're all in the mood for it. We're all very excited. And if you're out here in the UK, we can see the tickets now on sale too. So you can pick them up. I have managed to get mine. I will be heading to the BFI IMAX on Friday the 1st of March to watching a 70mm film. I'll then be going to the IMAX on the Saturday after to watch with my family as they all like Dune. So that's going to be one I'm excited for. But whilst we start hyping up what we're looking forward to, we are revisiting part one. It's just had its re-release in UK cinemas this weekend. I think it's had a re-release in America as well. It's actually grossed a couple of million, which is pretty good for a film that's, 2.5 years old? A few weeks before the sequel's out. And we're going to be talking about it, our experiences with it, our thoughts on maybe some of the characters, the cast, and a lot more. But I firstly want to jump over to you, Reece, without putting you on the spot too much. And maybe this is the question that's going to feel awkward. I cannot remember if I used to speak to you before Dune Part 1, because it's hit the point now where I've been very lucky going to screenings for a few years. And I definitely watched Dune Part 1 with Theo. I knew Charlie and Neil. I cannot remember how well I knew you back then, but I distinctly remember you being one of the biggest sort of Dune accounts on the film Twitter type stuff. So I don't want to be weird and ask, were you at the press screening for Dune 1? You probably were. But I want to just get your thoughts on the first Dune film as well, especially with Denny too.
Yeah, so look, going into Part 1, I was extremely enthusiastic. Number one, because I absolutely love the book. Number two, because Denny was leading the direction of the film. And number three, because I wanted the awful David Lynch version, a director who I absolutely love, to be completely erased from my memory. So I was hoping that that would happen with Dune Part 1. One of the things I went into the film understanding, however, is how complex the book is, how much information is in there. It's very rich on information, um, culture, complexities with each different person that gets introduced, different families that are introduced, different countries, different planets, whatever it may be, and there's a lot of information there. And one of the things that I thought the David Lynch film didn't do well was provide this information to the audience. Um, so yeah, you could say I was extremely enthusiastic about this film before it came out, and have been on the hype train of Dune Part One since it came out, because I do feel like with this one, there are a lot of people that love the film, and rightly so. It's a fantastic film, but I do feel like a lot of the naysayers for Part One are going to change their tune after seeing Part Two, because it is one part of a story. Similar to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part One and Part Two, it needed to be a two-part story. It was just so much information there, right? I do have a problem with a lot of these Part One and Part Twos, because I do feel like they're just being stretched out. Like The Hobbit, for instance, was stretched out to three films when it could have easily been one, at a push two. So a lot of these Part Ones and Part Twos are done for budget, are done for income, and of course, the more money, that the companies that are making these films can make. The more films you can make, better and better. But with Dune, the book is definitely suffices having part one and part two. And when part two arrives, I think the love for part one will also get extremely higher. But as much as I love part one, what I've seen from part two and having read the book, people are not ready. And the hype is real with part two. A lot of people that I know that have seen it have said they're talking about it being kind of Empire Strikes Back, the Dark Knight levels, which I don't like. I don't like them comparing it to sequels. Oh, it's a great sequel. Why can't Dune Part Two be Dune Part Two? I don't want it to be the Empire Strike Back of 2024, which I understand some of the information they're coming with. But this idea of just constantly comparing stuff to the old drives me a little bit insane. But Dune Part One, I was definitely one of the big advocates for it on Twitter when it came out because I've been a big fan of not only the first book but the second book as well. I do feel like as the books go on, it gets progressively more mind bendy and extremely hard to kind of work on screen. Don't want to say too much because that will get to spoiler territory for part two and Dune Messiah, which I do believe they'll make, but not immediately.
I'm kind of with you on this, sort of without segueing the conversation away from part one. Um, that was kind of what I was going to go. I've seen a lot of the. I think it's Christopher Nolan that said the Empire Strikes Back comparison, which I'll be honest, that's someone I don't mind saying that because he can get away with that because he also can't say, oh yeah, it was like the Dark Knight because he made it. And I know that him and Denny, I think, are quite close and respectively of the filmmaking process. I think, without doing the whole comparison, I think they are the two best directors of I say this current generation. That sounds really disrespectful, but I think those two to me are the sort of pillars. I don't count Tarantino. I see him, although even though he's probably not actually distant at ages, I see him as a bit further back, old school wise, which is probably
Yeah,
massively unfair given he's directed 9 films.
well,
And they've
Tarantino's
both
within
done
that
10.
Fincher kind of era, isn't
Yeah,
he? Early
yeah,
'90s, early 2000s. He's still making films now and still brilliant filmmaker. But
yeah.
yeah, I do feel like Tarantino, Nolan, and Villeneuve are kind of just the kind of era after. Even though they had films coming out that kind of period of time, they weren't immediately hot off the back. They didn't have that. You know what I mean? It
Yeah, it
wasn't
sort of happened in the
that
last
kind
sort
of
of 15 years.
exactly.
And I think this is where I'm really intrigued that I know that part two is releasing on 70mm IMAX, which I spoke about with BFI, a film that was shot digital, scanned in naturally like digital to have all the VFX done to then get reformatted into film. I think Denny has even spoken in interviews basically saying that he wanted it to be presentable in a 1:43 IMAX aspect ratio. That's why he's gone through the extra work to do so because he cares about the theatrical distribution. He cares about the audiences and them going to see it. And I think that's where I look at the sort of the flag bearers of like what is cinema, what are they trying to do, not the commercial aspect of they want people to go, but they genuinely do care about people's experiences watching their work. And if I were a filmmaker, I would have that exact same mentality that if you want people to go and seek your films, you want to put it on the biggest screens, but you don't just want to put it on the big screen. You want to make it for the big screen, which is where the studios get it all so wrong. They take an edited film, they chuck it in an IMAX without any aspect ratio change, thinking people will go for that. It's about how you present it, how you make it, and I think this is kind of where the excitement for Dune 2 Part 2 kicks in is that I've read the first book. I'm currently halfway through Messiah. I started reading that a week ago. So I'm in good timing to get it done by the time of the screening on the 21st. And this is where I'm in this sort of interesting tangent is all these comparisons I've come out to Dark Knight's Empire. You mentioned Harry Potter straight away, which is how I've always envisioned it. As soon as I started reading Dune for the first time before part one, it wasn't just like look at the size of this book. It's like you see the photos of all the Dune books together, and part one's the country. It's not like Harry Potter where it starts small and gets bigger and bigger. It's like starts fucking massive, and then there's a
Yeah, it's a
smaller one.
much bigger book.
Yeah, and I've not watched the David Lynch one, and you hear the stories that he wanted it to be longer. They couldn't do it. There was a TV miniseries of James McAvoy, I think, in the early 2000s. There's been loads of failed productions of Dune,
Yeah,
and it's something that shouldn't ever be adapted unless it's going to be done right. And we'll be talking a lot about Denis Villeneuve and his direction and his approach, actually, from a producing standpoint too, with this today. But
yeah.
I think it's really interesting that as we've got closer to part two, Messiah sort of feels inevitable at this point. Whereas when part one was coming out, I assume they do part two, but it's Warner Brothers, and no one ever knows with Warner Brothers. And I know they announced it the same weekend, didn't they? Part one came out, so I think we're going to get it. I know there are murmurs. I'm not going to do clickbait or that, but the talk of the town is a third Sicario film that Denny will direct. I know he didn't do the second one, and then he might look at doing Dune Messiah. Rumors talk online. I'm sure someone will ask him in a junket in the next week or two, so people find out. But I do think we'll get a gap, not as long a gap between the first and second book, but maybe a 5-6 year gap, which is fine. I mean, this is the same director that basically did like 5 films in 5 years, and all of them are unbelievable films, which I still don't know how a director was able to do them all in that such a way. But we are going to be talking some Japan, and kind of where I'll kickstart with this. I mentioned in pre-recording. If you're watching at home, do comment your thoughts on Dune. Let us know. Is it a film maybe you didn't gel with it as much? I know a few people that haven't enjoyed Dune. They've tried to watch it. They might have said sci-fi is not for them. The film's not for them. They might just say try and watch part 2 and then judge it in its completion. That we are going to have, you've seen. It's like, as you mentioned, Deathly Hallows, and I think that's where the comparisons are starting to go away now. That because I think we're getting the trilogy comparisons are now coming in, not part 1s and part 2s, because otherwise you're looking at Harry Potter, you're looking at Twilight, you're looking at, God, what was the other? Mockingjay did it as well. And I'm glad that I think the people that have gone to the cinema to watch a film like Dune have realised that, this part 1 doesn't have a definitive ending. Well, no, because you are just past the halfway point of the book. It isn't, you're not going to get some big, flashy, fake scripted fight at the end, because they haven't made it to entertain that purpose. They've made it as a defunct part 1.
Yes, that is exactly it, and that is what I love about Dune Part 1, which people might not like. It's why doesn't it finish on this big bang? Why isn't there a big fight happening? Well, that is the organic place to end the first film. I knew where it was going to end before I went in, and if it ended anywhere else, it wouldn't have made sense. It is literally a part 1 and part 2. It works so perfectly. And the second film is going to be extremely different to the first film. I think it's going to be a completely different type of film, and I do feel like the sci-fi nuts are going to love this one. Yes, there is some. I love the first one. I think the first one is brilliant, but I think it's also understanding it's a setup,
Yeah.
and that's why sometimes I don't like part 1s and part 2s, watching them separately. So one comes out in 2021, one comes out in 2024. It's like, well, I've had to wait 3 years for this film, and it's like, could you imagine you're reading a book and someone just took it off you halfway and said you'll get it back in 4 years? You'd be like, what? Like, what is going on here? And that is one of the things that kind of, when it comes to part 1s and part 2s, it drives me insane. I'm a big believer in having one story and watching it as a whole. But obviously, I understand you can't have a 6-hour film. Even though I would be sat in the theatre watching it 6 hours straight, it would not bother me personally. I understand why it is done.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that sort of, without just taking the discussion to another franchise, when I went to the cinema yesterday to rewatch part 1 at the IMAX, talking to some friends about Lord of the Rings before we went in, and I know that Lord of the Rings it's a combination of unfairly and fairly compared to Dune, that people look at Lord of the Rings, respectively, the literature side of it, forget the film adaptation at this point in time. From a literature standpoint, Lord of the Rings was this esteemed, unfilmable fantasy series. It will never be able to be done. It's impossible to be done. And Peter Jackson defied whatever laws or possibilities were ever in place. And for me, it's someone that isn't the biggest fan of fantasy as a genre. I still watch a lot of fantasy, but I'm more of a sci-fi person. I always have been. And that makes something like Dune far easier for me to be attracted to. I do sit there and go back towards the Rings, and you think it is insane in the 1990s that Peter Jackson, an almost unheard of filmmaker, makes 3 films back to back to back for this adaptation in New Zealand. Forget the glamorous other locations, in New Zealand, his home country, that would go on to change the landscape of cinema. And obviously, you'll read reports where it's like, you had Harry Potter happening at the same time as Lord of the Rings. You have the comic book boom. Dune was inevitable. It was always going to happen at some point, and that's what people speak of. I think Paramount spent years trying to do Dune before Legendary got the rights, and it all went kaput. But I still find it fascinating that in 2020, part one of Dune came out without part two locked in. I'm sure, there was a deal in place. If it would have met this certain expectation, A, B, and C, part two will happen. But there's a horrible alternate universe somewhere where we got this part one and never part two, which I think is a crime. If that had happened, I think Warner Brothers are already a studio with a lot of bad rep for very rightful reasons. Even this week on the news with the animated film, is it John Cena and Wiley Coyote, the Looney Tunes one, where there's talk of it going to Congress in the States and stuff like this. It's remarkable that Lord of the Rings ever happened, and I have to give credit to Peter Jackson for that. For everybody, I can't name all the producers. I don't know the Lord of the Rings history that much, but the fact that sort of 25 years later, we've got the sci-fi equivalent, and its future's not uncertain. We know we're going to be getting a series. We know there's going to be other things, but it's really interesting how Lord of the Rings genuinely stands on its own compared to anything else. That this was a studio that had the power. It wasn't a George Lucas individual who could say, I'm doing 3 Star Wars, no one can tell me what to do. This is Denis Villeneuve, his take on Dune, and we're going to kind of look at some of the behind the scenes of this too. But before we get into some behind the scenes, I really want to quickly, you mentioned before that you're a big fan of the book, that you'd seen the awful David Lynch one. I'm going to just counter very quickly with, not necessarily my memories of it, but my background with Dune before watching part one. It's Charlie, who's been on the channel loads. Ever since I've known her, she'd spoke about this book, Dune. We met in, December 2017? So around the time Last Jedi came out. That was literally how we met. And at some point, I don't know how soon it was, the Dune stuff was taken off the ground. We'll probably go through it shortly on the behind-the-scenes stuff, but she'd always spoke about this Dune film, and I knew nothing about it. I hadn't heard of it. I hadn't seen the David Lynch one. I hadn't read the book. I didn't know much about the sandworm stuff, but it was always brought up by Charlie. And as time was going by, obviously I love Blade Runner 2049, and Denis Villeneuve was obviously attached to this Dune film. And I remember hearing the most about it, and I don't know if you remember this. He was offered, obviously, what would go on to be No Time to Die to do the Bond film, and he declined it. And he was basically like, if I don't do Dune now, someone else is going to do it, and I'll never, ever be able to live that down and do a Bond film. So at that point, and I 100% agree with him too, because he can do a Bond film at any point in his life if he wants to.
Exactly. He's going to have so many options to make a Bond film, isn't he?
Yeah, and especially, you're doing Craig's last one, you're sort of locked in a creative corner there, and it's really interesting that Dune was starting to get this momentum. And I remember a picture of Timothée Chalamet obviously I wouldn't know it's canon at the time. I was like, wow, he looks like Kylo Ren. Like, that's a really nice black suit. There's like ships in the background. It's land, it's water. I was like, this is like Star Wars. And I didn't read Dune until a few months before. I say a few months before part one. I started reading Dune part one just before, and I'm in a very weird state with adaptations. And tell me if this is awful. I don't read enough books. I know that anyway. I can read, obviously. I know I used to read a lot when I was younger, but as I got older, I preferred watching films, stuff like that. And the amount of books I own that are like the books that a film would go on to be, I've got like Black Klansman. I've got so many books that are like what the adaptation Oscars get nominated from that I've not read. There's probably a horrible shelf where they're all there together. And for Dune, I was like, no, I'm going to read Dune. But I wanted to wait until I'd seen trailers. And this is where it gets weird. And maybe I blame this on Harry Potter because obviously I saw the first few Harry Potter films before I read them all. I like to see who has been cast, and I like to visually have the reference of the person playing this role. So every few pages when I was reading Dune for the first time, this name appears. And it's like Fade. I'm like, no one's playing Fade in the film, and we'll get to that. And I was like, who's the Baron? I was like, oh, okay, Skarsgård, great. And I started to picture people, and that made the experience reading it not so much more interesting, but that's how I like to enjoy reading books, is having a visual. Obviously, I can still read books without knowing who they are, but to me, that's a really big thing. And I was smashing it out, and then I didn't think I'd get into the Dune Part 1 press screening. Suddenly, my plan was cut short by, I think, about 3 weeks. It came out, I was at the No Time to Die premiere, and when I was getting ready, the invite came, and I feel like there were tons of press screenings, actually. Now my mind's starting to go back to it. There were a lot, because it wasn't going to be a certified hit. There were a lot of screenings, and I picked a Wednesday, and I was like, shit, I've got to now get this book done about 2-3 weeks before I intended to. Cut a long story short, I didn't finish the book before the press screening, but on the train journey to London, I got about 20 pages past where part 1 finished. So when part one finished, I had this lovely sigh of relief, like, thank God for that. I've read this half, and then I smashed part two literally within about 2 days. Absolutely loved it. Again, visually, there were things that you could obviously see from part one. I know I was very lucky to have seen part one early, but it's a series. And then Charlie, I mentioned earlier, she gifted me a copy of Dune Messiah, which is obviously sat on the shelf until last week, for a few years, which I'm now reading through. So it's really interesting with Dune, and there are so many people, like from a creative standpoint, that are involved, actors that we'll talk about. Soundtrack was one of the biggest draws for me before I knew anything about the film, which we'll also talk about. So it's a really interesting one, and I think what's been interesting with Dune over the years is like speaks like my granddad, who had obviously read the book back in the 60s and 70s, and he's big on literature, and he was like, "Wait, my grandson's like read Dune," and obviously he's not going to bother watching the films because he's a bit older, but it's really interesting discussing people that are aware of Dune. And you see the front cover, like, oh no, I do recognise, I've seen these worms somewhere before. I just didn't know the context of these giant worms. There isn't Beetlejuice. And yeah, sorry to go on a weird tangent, but it's an interesting one with Dune. And I do feel that there's a lot of people that would have gone to the book before the first part came out. And I bet a lot in the last couple of years, I keep seeing Waterstones advertising different editions that sell out on the spot. And it's really interesting seeing what this has done. And we'll talk about, I know people hate talking box office at the end, but this film was a rarity in the aspect that Warner Brothers did their awful day streaming day one with the cinema, and Dune's one of the few films that was able to like live to tell the story of winning at the box office. And yeah, sorry, that's a lot of me talking my history with it, but does that surprise you in any way? Like, is it a psychopathic thing to want to know the actors before you read the book?
No, so I'm very different. That I like to have my own imagination when reading the book, and I always like to. The thing is with Dune is I feel like it's very much not just so much the characters, but the landscapes and the
Yeah.
environment of part one was very much what I had in my head from reading the book. Whereas watching the David Lynch version, or even the Children of Dune, the McAvoy TV series, which focuses on the third book in the series, it didn't fully it wasn't fully what I expected it to be. And it's like Harry Potter. I read all the Harry Potter books before I seen the films. They were like the first book series that I was into. So because I was so young, I don't think I formulated enough background and everything from the character. And I do feel like good books will explain and everyone will have a vision on it, but I'm not going to be thinking A and you're not going to be thinking Z when it comes to visualization of what the film should look like. And I do feel like technological advancements, budget,
Yeah.
these things massively help Denis compared to what David had to go through. And we all know that he hated the film. And I'm a massive David Lynch fan, which is weird because I hate that film. There's not many filmmakers that I would say are in my like top 10, and I hate one of their films. But I do actually hate that film. So there's small things that come into play, which change my way reading the books. But I definitely like to read the book before watching the film. One of the film, which is like a franchise which most people wouldn't associate with me, is Twilight. Went to the cinema with my mates to watch a film. I can't remember what film it was back in 2008 when Twilight came out. That film weren't on. They were like, "Oh, we're going to go to the pub," and I was like, "No, I'm going to go watch this film that's on because I'm here." And obviously, I'm a much bigger film buff than they are. I go to the cinema all the time. And Twilight wasn't a film that I was aware of. So I went into Twilight, watched the film, and I went home, read the books. And when I'm reading the book, I'm seeing Christian Stewart. I'm seeing Robert Pattinson. I'm seeing all the Cullens as the characters that they're played, the actors that they're played by on screen. So now when I'm reading every book after that, I'm seeing visually everything that I've seen from the film. Which again, it depends
What you're reading, I guess.
yeah, what you're reading and how visually it is. There's some stories that are very much. If I'm reading a crime novel and it's all about a murder, a lot of the aesthetic stuff is probably not going to be as important. But with Dune, the aesthetic is such a large part of the movie. The world's created, the vast kind of space that you get with the Dune world. It needs to be shown on screen, and that needs to be described in a certain way that not many books can do. But yeah, I definitely try and read the books before watching the films. But like Poor Things, for instance, Killers of the Flower Moon, American Psycho. I watched all them books before reading the film. Watched all them films before reading the books, and then when I came out of the film, I was like, "Oh, that's a banging film. Let's see what the book is like." Um, and I'm like you. I do have a shelf at home, pretty much above me right now, that I have books that I bought within the past 12 months or so that I haven't read yet, and I really need to start reading a little bit more for sure.
Yeah, but it's good, and I think everyone has such different experiences. And for a film like this, it really does come to that it's one thing to have the source material, but then we segue into one of the biggest things. But to me, it comes down to who is the creative mind that is putting this together. Now, I spoke about Master of the Air recently. That's a TV series, of course, based off real life, but it's based also off books from the war, written by some of the pilots. And that's Gary Gertzman that does the entirety of that series. That's Gary Gertzman that is going through the books of Tom Hanks, and it all comes down to your creative team that you hire for these projects. Because of course, Peter Jackson in Lord of the Rings is one thing, but if Peter Jackson, underneath his sort of pyramid system of the director, and this maybe sounds disrespectful, and people will disagree, but I think I definitely don't agree that the best directors do big films. No, but I think there are certain, and this doesn't take away from anyone's ability to direct, but when you see directors that can inherently manage a $200 million budget as well as a $2 million budget, I think that tends to show not like just their expertise, that shows that their systematic approach to the process. They can cater to any budget. Audiences change, shift focus changes. This is why I rave about Nolan for so many of the reasons. He not knows his audience, but he's creating films for the audiences to go to. And kind of what I'm trying to segue this with Denis Villeneuve is that we look at some of his other films, and even off the back of Blade Runner, that was a financial bomb. I know none of us care about that because it's an unbelievable film. But no doubt in the back of Warner Brothers' mind, they're probably thinking, shit, is this film going to be bankable? Like, do we know that? Because he'd done great films before, some amazing films before, we're going to add. And I always find it interesting when a director jumps up, and I don't want to just slag off Marvel for the sake of slagging off Marvel, but we've seen it a lot in the last 10, 15 years where you have a great director, does one or two very small budget films, then he's put into the studio system. Yes, he gets to direct a studio film. Yes, he wants to direct that type of film. But then ultimately he's a cog on a machine that the moment you start to realize that creative freedom is disappearing, they don't actually have it to begin with. It's like an illusion. And some of them break free from that. Again, I'll say Nolan, he made the Dark Knight trilogy his own. Whereas again, you can look at Marvel, and some great directors have been in there, some wonderful directors in there, some auteurs have been in there, but you can tell at what point is it the Marvel film, what point is the director's film, and then you look at their careers outside of that too. But enough Marvel talk. I don't want to ever have to bring Marvel up again in this great Dune discussion. But yeah, we're going to start talking about Denis Villeneuve because, as far as I'm concerned, this whole entirety of this video, what we're doing on the channel, these films, the cast, everything, it all comes down to his creative genius. And it's not something I've really been able to talk about with admiration on the channel. For those that followed us, we wanted to do a retrospective on his career so far. With the delays last year, we couldn't do so, and we couldn't rework it. So we're kind of doing our best by doing this Dune video today. But really, it begins with Legendary acquiring the rights to the books in 2011, which is something I didn't even know studios could do. As in, you assume that they just take the film rights, the book rights, the TV rights, all of it in one foul sweep. No, they got the book rights in 2011, but they didn't acquire the film rights until 2016, which also includes TV, which we now know is a very important thing for Dune moving forwards. If there are to be, I don't want to call it a cinematic universe, let's get away from that catchphrase, but there is going to be a sisterhood film about the Bene Gesserit. I believe there was another TV show that spoke about. There is potential, and like the books, like Lord of the Rings, where the son of the author has continued the family work over the decades, no doubt there is room to tell more stories with Dune, but I don't think this is ever going to be a Star Wars. I don't think this is ever going to be a Marvel type thing. I really, if I'm completely honest, without sounding judgmental, I'm not bothered about any project that doesn't have Denis Villeneuve's name attached to it at present. That might change in the future, but that's how I feel about Dune after one film so far and weeks away from the second one. But just going with that behind the scenes, when Denis was chosen, he had been spoke to Legendary about this before, not just Blade Runner, before Arrival. So I believe he was officially announced to direct this film a week after Arrival had its Oscar nominations. and he still continued Blade Runner. And the reason I'm sort of saying this too, you see some directors juggle 3, 4 projects at once. Spielberg's the master of it for reasons everybody already knows. He can do 3 films with the next 3 plans. Some directors will do a post production, whilst others are in pre production. But Denis Villeneuve didn't want to do anything with Dune until he'd finished Blade Runner.
Yeah.
I quite like that process from directors. Not in a rude way, like, oh, they're not fully committed. I'm looking at Nolan and the logic that I don't want to get into the Bond talk with it, but if Nolan had said in the last 7 months he's doing the next Bond film, whilst he's doing his Oppenheimer marketing for the film, whilst he's doing his Oppenheimer press tour for the Oscars, he's only going to be asked about James Bond, not Oppenheimer. And I do think it really helps the director if there is one thing to focus on, then move on to the next. And it's something, I guess, on a personal level I tire with when I see junket interviews where, same old franchises, random actor gets asked, what's your thoughts on this random film with nothing to do with what we're promoting today?
Yeah.
And it's stuff like that detracts from what is normally not. It's what I want to see. What I want to see the film, the marketing,
Focus of the film, right?
Yeah,
So just
that's the better word.
just a quick one on that then. Do you think that Christopher Nolan and Aaron Taylor Johnson get announced as the lead and the director of Bond after Oscar night?
He'll do a mic drop with his Oscar statue. It's like, by the way, November 2025.
Yeah.
Listen, if it happens, and this is me saying this, and I think I did this back in like July in a video last year. I did say that I think we'd hit. Now the strikes obviously happened, which has obviously delayed everything further. The combo potentially of Nolan and Taylor Johnson. I look at the Tenet cameo. I still find that one of the weirdest roles I've ever seen because he wasn't marketed to begin with. He wasn't in the initial casting. He ended up being in like the final scenes of the film in clearly what became a more important role as the film went on. I'm not saying it was planted by a studio. I'm not saying that at all. I still find the Aaron Taylor Johnson role in Tenet so weird. And a hypothetical, if those two are the next Bond actor and director, then to me that means that this was planned fucking many years ago to find him a role similar to that. Testing chemistry, but a literal, we're doing it on the pitch type comparison rather than behind the scenes in training. That's my thoughts. But I also love the fact that we've been able to celebrate Oppenheimer for 6-7 months. And if Nolan is doing Bond, we'll probably find out about it as soon as the Oscars ceremony has been and gone. It will be. And also from a business standpoint, let's be honest, he's going to win Best Director at this point in time. Whatever he can negotiate, he already has power now. He'll have more power in a month's time. And at that point, you'll be looking at Broccoli saying you had it on a plate for Nolan to do for you.
And to bring this back to a Dune discussion, do you think when Denny wins next year for part 2, which again we'll get to, I believe we're going to get to the awards and stuff of the film, but I won't touch base on it now. Though I'll let you get to that when we get to that.
No, because
it's a big part of the film,
yep.
And it's one of the things which a lot of the discussion this year with the Oscars was Greta Gerwig not getting a nomination when Barbie got 8 Best Director, and obviously this film got nominated for 10 Oscars, won 6, and Denny didn't get a Best Director nom. So I do feel like a lot of this and Furiosa, for me, are probably going to be just based on their previous films and kind of who is leading these films and who's back in the chair for the cinematography, the editing, and everything. I do feel like Dune Part 2 and Furiosa are going to be going at each other's neck for the technical awards next year. And do you think that could have a knock-on effect with Denny and what he chooses to do next? Because, like you said, he had an opportunity to do No Time to Die, decided to go with Dune Part 2. Does that kind of set him up to be the next Bond director after Nolan? And I know it's probably going to be a bit too soon to announce that based on we haven't even got to...
No, I like it though. I like it because it's what I think they're the two best directors of their respective like timing. And I love the fact that both of them are always rumoured to do a Bond film. And I think with Denny's interesting. I mean, without jumping to Oscars too quickly, years ago on this channel, I said, this is obviously COVID, I was like, oh, this year we're getting Scorsese versus Spielberg and Fabelmans versus Killers of the Flower Moon at the Oscars. And I was like, it's like planning a WrestleMania. And it's like, and then next year you're going to get Oppenheimer versus Dune Part 2.
Yeah.
Obviously, Scorsese's film would go on to be delayed. Fableman's would obviously not win anyway. But I did think at this point last year still, fuck, we're going to get Oppenheimer versus Dune this year. It's going to be the career Oscar for one of Nolan or Denny. I am honestly, again, I've not seen Dune Part 2. I'm not being a snob with blockbusters or anything like that. I love seeing blockbuster films being recognised at award ceremonies. I think there's a horrible stigma against them. I don't care about this nonsensical Golden Globe for Best Cinematic Achievement. I understand what they were trying to do, but it was so blurred. They've made the obvious choice of giving it the highest grossing film of the year, and that now just needs to be the award moving forward. But everybody knows the highest grossing film of the year because we get the numbers reported to us. If no one ever knew a box office figure, and you came out on Oscars night and was like, the highest grossing film of 2023 was Barbie, that'd be unreal. But the world's known that since July last year. And it's a
Yeah.
really interesting one with these two where I think we've got two all timers. I mean, I know Nolan's done his, you could argue his studio trilogy 15 years ago, but when people talk about the best trilogies of the last decade, last 20 years, they talk about The Dark Knight by country mile. Maybe not last 20 years because then you bring Lord of the Rings into it, but when you get the old recent memory type tweets or the last 10 years, people think about Dark Knight, and I think Dune has the potential to be up there. And I think Denny's very much looking at it as his trilogy. And if it does go on to have the acclaim for his career, I think he'll be in a Nolan scenario where he could probably do a lot of what he wants to at this point in time. But even Nolan, who is probably one of the most profitable directors of the last 15 years, even he doesn't have the I mean, he's got the power now, but even pre-Oppenheimer, people are like, oh, can he do it? Can he deliver? And I think we're going to see Denny head toward that. And this part one is one of the first steps in that journey. It's not talking about the quality of his previous work. It's that the global audience of bringing in your work as a director, making not necessarily yourself a household name. It's not just about that because the industry knows who you are. It's about connecting to the mass audiences. And I think these are the films that are going to do that for him. You look at Peter Jackson in Lord of the Rings, he did his King Kong. He wanted to do King Kong. He'd always wanted to do a King Kong film. And then he's done essentially a George Lucas, which is no criticism. He has gone into a more behind the scenes. I'm developing new technologies for this industry. He's doing all the behind the scenes of which I love. Even though I'm not sure about the Beatles documentary. His World War One documentary, on the other hand, was unbelievable. And I think it's really interesting with these directors seeing what they're going to sort of move on to do. But I don't know if that actually answered the question. But talking more with Denny, let's talk about him bringing on board. So I mentioned already he's done one of the most insane directorial runs of his career. I think year to year to year, is it Enemy followed by it's Prisoners followed by Enemy followed by Arrival followed by Blade Runner Part 2, and almost annual tradition. No, I miss Sicario. How are you missing a film like Sicario? That he's on a run of 5 films in 5 years, and he doesn't stop. I don't know how. People talk about workhorses. I don't know how he just didn't stop making films at this point in time. But him to come onto Dune, and he's had a key creative team with him. The one big missing name is Roger Deakins, who people would argue is the greatest cinematographer of all time. Who do you replace Roger Deakins with? You bring in Greg Fraser, who, in the context of innovation, a lot of great recent Oppenheimer memes, I guess we can say at this point in time, has now created the volume, for better or worse. I think for the better, for the films that actually know how to use it. But he's bringing on board a creative team to map out his Dune films with. And this is where we're going to kind of stem in this conversation before we really get it. I say we really get into it for 40 minutes at this point in time. But he almost sets up the shop, nails everything in place, the behind the scenes. Like I mentioned, cinematography, the editing, the costume designers, the soundtrack with Hans Zimmer. Everything is brought in before he gets to filming, before he gets to casting. And it's a really interesting approach that I don't think happens a lot in modern Hollywood. I don't think it happens on big films. How often do we watch a big film where people are coming and going? People get announced on day one. David Leitch for Jurassic World, he's been announced that he's in talks and out of talks inside 3 days, but the film was apparently coming out in a year and 3 months. You get nonsense like that in modern Hollywood. And I have to give credit to Legendary and Warner Brothers for allowing Denny to have the time to finish his other films, to allowing him to map out what he wants to do from a story perspective. This is, of course, pre-COVID, which is one of the biggest, changes to the cinematic industry that this film, as hundreds of others, have been affected by. And I think it's really interesting that as he's involved more creatively, even I can't remember the name of the language person, but they hired the Game of Thrones. I don't know what the name of the role is, but whoever created the Dothraki language was hired to create the languages within Dune. There is a name for that kind of role, but it wasn't an afterthought in post. It wasn't this. Everything was meticulously planned out, and kind of bringing a Nolan comparison back into it. Nolan, who spoke about not being competent enough to direct Dunkirk pre 2017, from his own words, Denis Villeneuve almost implied the same, that it was his goal to direct Dune, but he wasn't ready to do Dune in his career until this point. And I really like hearing that from directors, because it's not self critique, it's not ego, it is an honest truth that comes from them. And I think that makes their filmmaking even better, because they're being honest with the audience, that they themselves don't know if they're ready to do something. But when they are committed to it, when the final outcome is like this, then we get to see it for that we get to see them maybe at their peak, maybe heading in towards their peak, or their most, I don't know what you call it, where it's like a Spielberg, right? You get to film number 3, then he just sits at the top of the mountain for decades. What are your thoughts on Denny bringing his team on board? And we'll get into some more of it after when we get into the cast. But again, we spoke a lot about him already. But to me, the more you talk about Dune, the more you read into Dune, it feels like it's Denny's project, not the studio's. And of course, it is a studio project. But to me, this series starts and ends with him at the helm.
Yeah, it's definitely a credit to him and the way he goes about building his films. I do feel like a lot of the best directors, filmmakers do have that approach and that kind of gravitas that allows them to do that. You find a lot of these films that get chucked onto Netflix or Amazon Prime, it's the directors found, they don't really have any say in who's doing this, that, or whatever. They're kind of head to set and direct what's in front of them. Whereas Denny is a filmmaker more so than a director, right? Even though he is a director, that is his kind of placard that comes in front of him on a film set. He is a filmmaker, and he knows what he wants from the get go. He has a clear vision of what he wants to have, and he knows the best avenue to get what he wants. And someone like Greg Fraser, when Roger Deakins is not available, it's just, it makes sense. And yeah, I think his back catalogue just shows that you give this man what he needs behind the camera, and it will generally give you what you want in front of the camera. And I think you add those. Look, if I was an actor and someone said, "Oh, they're filming a adaptation of Dune. It's directed by Denny. It's got Greg Fraser behind the camera. It's telling me all. It's like, okay, I want to work. I want to work with those people. I know what their CVs say, rather than, oh, it's a Denny film and it's being led by Timothy Chalamet. Who else is in the film? Who's behind the camera? I don't know yet. We'll get to that when we get to that. You can always tell when it's just generated at money or when there's some general care about what's happening, right? And don't get me wrong, I think Timothy's a good actor. I'm a big fan of his. I've had him for a while. But yeah, I do feel like the way they approached it is a film which had the utmost respect for the source material, and they had the utmost respect for putting a piece of art forward rather than a money making experience.
Yeah, and kind of sticking with the adaptation term, this is something I've moaned about a lot over the last few years. Some people believe that to be an adaptation, it has to be a page to page, word to word, carbon copy replica of whatever it is that is being quote adapted. And I agree with a good probably 2/3 of what I see online with stuff like that. Certainly when it's real life historical stuff being adapted onto the big screen. At the same time, anything you've read on a page that is a history book, I've always liked the phrase history books are written by the runners. Because more often than not, the more you go back into your history, you look at what you're reading, you're looking at the story, the perspectives is a very different thing. And in the immortal words of Ridley Scott, probably the best person to say for this, he'll turn around and be like, well, as he said of Napoleon, were the historians there? Obviously, very different in the case of Napoleon to Dune. But Denis Villeneuve took an approach to this where I think he spoke about shooting on the deserts and whatnot. And he kind of implied that in the 1960s, when the book was published, people would look to the Arabic cultures as the inspiration for Dune, which was bang on. But in the year sort of 2019, 18, whenever they're filming it, the Arabic cultures are so intertwined with their own societies now that isn't there like it was 50 years ago. We need to create the futures of tomorrow for this story to function today. And he didn't say it obviously like that. That's my interpretation of how he spoke about it. But this is my whole science fiction approach, that when people talk about Star Wars, they went to the cinema at the age of 10 or whatever, and they looked up on the screen and saw these other worlds, and it blew them away. In 2021, you cannot do that like Star Wars. You cannot say, look, it's an ice planet. There's only ice here. Yes, we're on a sand planet, we know. We're under what influenced Star Wars. And the moment in this film when we're seeing not even just the opening scenes, we're going to places like Caladan, we're going to Arrakis, Gideon Prime or Heidi Prime, I can't remember what the Harkonnen world is. That's science fiction that we don't have here. That's not a location somewhere in this part of the world which you can say is a planet. There is a clear and conscious identity, and that is his approach to making this, is that not only does it need to function as sci-fi, it needs to function for people to film on. It's being used on not just CGI, there's going to be real sets too. I think a lot of this is filmed in Hungary. A lot of this, of course, filmed on location in the deserts, but it's really interesting that his approach, and as you mentioned, he's following the source material. There's a few changes he makes to the source material. In part one, one of the big ones is, of course, Lady Jessica, that he chooses to, I believe, make her a Bene Gesserit, which I don't think she is in the book. I've only read it once, so apologies if I'm wrong on that. But he essentially implied that the part one film has to be the story of Lady Jessica and Paul Atreides. I'm going to consciously remove some characters from being in part one. I mentioned Fade earlier. That's one of the biggest probably talking points. I'm going to gender switch one character, Kite, which I think is one of the best decisions they did, and she's far more interesting in this film than she's in the book, from what I remember. But also, he's going to then reduce the roles of people such as the Baron, such as the Emperor, such as the Princess. And whilst part two wasn't confirmed at this point, to me, I hate the word mapping out, but Denis Villeneuve knows exactly what he wants to do with part one and exactly what he wants to do with part two. Now, we've not witnessed part two yet, and we will soon. We will all witness part two soon. But I think those big creative decisions he did, and again, some people online would like to use the term adaptation to copy it word for word. You don't ever want to copy it word for word, because go read the book if you only want to see it word for word. People moan about The Lion King being a shot-for-shot remake. Hey, I can't have someone saying, if you're going to adapt The Lion King, don't do. Do you know the logic is it's normally the same people, and you can have the same hypocritical approach. They moan about a book not being followed properly, then they moan that a film is being copied the same. So there's no winning. But with a film like Dune, again, you have a filmmaker who has a clear and conscious idea of what he wants to do with his source material, how he wants to translate it onto the big screen. I cannot fault any of his approach to it, and it's one of the only times I've gone to the cinema in my life, especially in adult age, watched a science fiction film and genuinely thought, I actually feel like I'm on a different planet in a different world. And it's such an awful cliche, but I don't feel that so much of the time. I love Mad Max. I absolutely adore it. It's post-apocalyptic. I know that's a desert in Australia, and there's no problem with that. I still have the most entertaining time of my life watching Fury Road. But then I'm watching a film like Dune, and I can pinpoint the moment at the cinema I knew this was going to be a masterpiece. When they're leaving Caladan, yes, it's 25 minutes in. There's already been some great sequences. When the ship emerges from the water ripples as they're transporting planets, that's one of my favorite sequences in this entire film. And maybe it's the Greg Fraser, maybe it's how he shoots scale, maybe it's the Hans Zimmer music, maybe it's the direction, but it was at that point watching it for the first time, and every time I listen to the soundtrack, every time I rewatch the film, that's where I feel like, fucking hell, like, this is it. We're off. Is that a weird thing to say?
No, not at all. I agree with you. I think it's a masterful film in that retrospect, and I feel like it does transport you to a different place, and it does feel like out of, well, again, a lot of these, Star Wars is one of the big ones, of course, but a lot of sci-fi films, again, yes, you can immediately see where the CGI and the real world comes into play, and you can tell these real world places and when it's set. And with Dune, it's very hard to tell what's real, what's not, and kind of where's which. And I do find that to be outstanding filmmaking. Whereas it be from the production design to the cinematography to the editing, there's so many things. Even one of the unsung heroes when it comes to films is the set locators. people who find
Yeah.
the sets, the locations, to the filming locations are just, it just changes the aesthetic of a film completely. And it just allows for an unbelievable cinematography to take place. And Dune, obviously, with it being all off world and none of it on a human planet, I say a human planet, on planet Earth, um, I don't know, just it does, it feels extremely organic. It's all very humanoid as well, which helps. I do feel like sometimes a lot of these sci-fi films immediately go to non-humanoid characters, and it's just 50-50. So non-humanoid and humanoid kind of mix in, colorful characters and non-humanoid, and it just looks, all these films just look part and parcel exactly the same. And I don't feel like Dune has that. It's very much a real world type of film, just different planets that we're not aware of.
Yeah, and I think, and I mentioned Star Wars with that, but Dune is almost that father of the sci-fi novel. When you hear, I think in the original draft, before it was Luke Skywalker, I'm pretty sure I've heard in the past that there was talk that Luke Skywalker at some point was called Paul, and it's like, Paul on a desert planet. A couple of years after this book comes out in 1968, I wonder who influenced that. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That's not a criticism of Star Wars. That is, George Lucas was a you can look at any of his Star Wars films and the influence from real life politics to films to foreign cinema to everything like that. George Lucas is massively underrated in his approach to the industry because of what he has done with respect to CGI and franchising. Um, and I think Dune is one of those where, before this film came out, everyone's like, oh, this is Star Wars for grown up, Star Wars for adults. And as I've got older, we're sort of not going into the story per se, but before we get into the characters, the thing I love most about Dune, and it's always a tricky thing to talk politics, the interworld politics I absolutely adore. It's the same with Game of Thrones. I prefer Game of Thrones not for its fantasy, not for any of that. I love the political aspect of it. I think if you can get politics right in fictional film and TV, it can be the most entertaining thing. Now, I don't know if that says a lot about me. I don't know if that makes me sound like a weirdo. And I'm certainly not getting into like real life politics at the moment and stuff like that. Obviously, I've done it on the channel before. But I think as far as writing goes, the writers that are able to do that, I think are more often than not some of the best. Even let's go modern day, Armando Iannucci, who can do incredible satire after satire. You look at the thick of it; it's hard to look at now because so much of it came real. But it's a really tricky thing to do to write politics. And if you really nail down this part one, really, the whole logic that the Atreides are basically potentially getting too strong, so the Emperor needs to squash and weaken this giant house before they could ever possibly be a threat to him. That's really where the story goes. You get the Harkonnen to the, let's be honest, the caricatural villains per se, but what does this film do? Rather than making the caricatural villains, let's just have them be plotting, be schemers, be villains. Assumption, let's develop them in part two, which I think we're going to get a lot of, with one of them being notably absent, who's obviously going to be played by Austin Butler. We can't wait to see. Not doing the Elvis voice confirmed, which is a shame.
Yeah,
But
that voice. The funny thing
I
is
love
with the
his,
voice, yeah, no, I do too, and I think
but
it's
he's
turned
actually
into
got a
such an
naturally southern
over,
voice.
yeah, it's turned into an extremely overblown thing. And I seen someone the other day say his voice in June is awful. I'm like, no, it's perfect.
Yeah,
His voice is very, it's perfect. The character is, I haven't read the book in years now, but I don't feel like his character was massive in the
no,
book anyway, compared to making being both films. And I do feel like, obviously, people with Zendaya in the first film were extremely annoyed because she's not in the film that much, but she's not in the first half of the book at all.
yeah,
The character, so I understand why people would be annoyed. But the beginning of the film is literally Paul, Jessica, the Duke, who passes away extremely quick. Gurney and Duncan, Idaho. That is pretty much, and of course the rat on the bunch. But Dr. Hines. But it's very much, yeah. I think it's set up in a certain way that you have other characters introduced in the second part. And the big bad, you could call them the Harkonnens, are not really the big bad per
no.
se. It's more the kind of the environment that they're in. They're kind of being used by the leaders of the government to control the spice for intergalactic travel, which is just yeah. It gets further into the books, it's more understandable of what's happening and how well dynamic it is, and how much more based on kind of real life politics it is. And I've seen a lot of the initial reactions when the first film came out was in relation to oil and all these Arab countries, whereas that's not part one might give that kind of feel, but that's not the book at all. Um, and I do feel like a lot of the criticism that the first film got is going to go away when the second one comes out, because it's not it's not a white savior piece. You know, it's definitely not a white
No,
savior piece. And I think it's funny that people were so quick to jump on things without fully understanding the complexities of the story. And that's why I, again, don't want to keep going back to it, but having a film as a part one and a part two, it's hard to justify an opinion on the first part when you haven't seen the second bit. And it was extremely, I've been holding back from having conversations about this film from 2021 when it came out, because I just wanted to tell people, stop, just relax, just wait until the second and third film comes out. And it's just not what you think it is. And when I really think that this film is going to be held in much higher regard when part two comes out. I really, really do.
yeah, I think when you're going to get not like a back-to-back screen, but when you're going to have them side by side, create. Let's talk. I mean, okay, I don't remember it. I was 5 years old. Fellowship of the Ring comes out. Imagine waiting 3 years for Two Towers. And imagine that being the 21st century. It's not 21st century, it was. Imagine that being like the 2010s or something, right, with social media. The people, I mean, I can tell you, the first time I watched Lord of the Rings, it was many years after. I got a DVD box set of the three of them together. They were the theatricals, didn't know there was an extended. Didn't even know what extended would have meant back then. And I remember getting to the end of the first one and I was gutted. And I was like, they've got a long way to go to get to this volcano in the first film. Didn't realise it's the story across three films. And I'd imagine, someone Lord of the Rings fans is going to cry somewhere because I implied I didn't know it at the age of 12 and I didn't. But Dune is like that. That there'll be people that would have watched part one thinking it's its own thing and will then realise eventually, okay, no, it needs the part two. And Messiah is going to be some batshit insane part three / epilogue / whatever you want it to be. But it's going to be made, we hope. And it makes it really interesting for this. As you mentioned, the real world politics. I go to Game of Thrones. And I remember watching, when I was reading Dune the first time, I was like, wow, these Harkonnens are a lot like the Lannisters, and these Atreides, they're a lot like the Starks. And I'm not saying, George R. R. Martin's nabbed it at all, but it's traditional, as you mentioned. You go into real world politics, you can go as far back as you want. We've had the story of the Harkonnens and the Atreides for centuries. You can go back probably further than centuries, maybe even millennium ago. And I think this is where the story really excels, that politics is a tricky thing to put on the big screen too. And I think this film handles it in a really subtle way that isn't too much, that isn't over the top. At some points, they even black and white spell out the Emperor's sent us here to die. Brilliant. Clap. Bravado. Well done. He's not in the first film. Now let's go and cast a villain to play him in the second one. And he is going to be the villain. And again, Star Wars also had an Emperor that appeared in the third film. Well, this one's going to be in the second film. And the logic of the Imperium that have ruled it, that they want to weaken the strongest houses to essentially keep him in charge. I love this sort of stuff. I prefer this. I like the politics. And that's why, like, as a kid, maybe the prequels subconsciously got me into politics. Who knows? But when I grew up, I'm like, wait, people hate the politics in Star Wars. I was like, but why? Like, obviously you get older, you realize, okay, people just don't like politics, and that's fine and respectable. But I was like, it's a really tricky thing to do it in film. And I think if you get the politics wrong in Dune, the film's not going to function. You think it's a basis story of good versus evil, and if you do, your mind is going to be blown over the next few years.
Yeah, it's an in-depth kind of thing with politics, and I feel like politics is people being controlled to do jobs that the other people don't want to do. So they're forcing people to do stuff that they don't want to do, which is pretty much Dune as a whole. People being enforced and being kind of swayed politically to do stuff that they don't believe in, or to be kind of made to believe that this is the right thing to do. And obviously there's a lot of the religion involved in the film. It's a very religious based and political series. And yeah, it's fantastic. I just love the. Again, I'm not a fan of politics or religion in the real world, but the reason why I'm not a fan is because I am baffled by the ins and outs that go on with both religion and politics, and to see it done in film to an extent. I don't know how people that watch films all the time and see politics kind of brought out on a theatrical standard still have the same faith in religion and politics. But myself as a film fan, that's definitely had an effect on me and my beliefs in life for sure.
No, and I get that 100% as well. And kind of sticking it, we're not going to go through every character like name by name, but we might end up chatting about a good chunk of them. I want to talk the cast first of all as an ensemble. One of my favourite casts immediately. Look at the careers. I know it's only been 2 years. We can't say look at what they've gone on to do. I think we will be looking back at certainly the two we know of so far, Dune Part 1 and 2, in 20 years' time. I reckon a good chunk of this cast would have won Oscars if they haven't already in the next 5 years. The fact, I'm not saying it's about winning Oscars, but in retrospect, this is a cast and ensemble for the ages. Again, I'm going to chuck Lord of the Rings in there. You can chuck. I'm not going to be rude and say Chuck Star Wars. I probably wouldn't, irrespectively of that being completely different. But you look at some of those films that you don't. Band of Brothers, recent TV, for example. That show has aged better, not just because of the quality, because of everything in it. The cast members have gone on to have such incredible careers that, in retrospect, enhances that show. And I
It's
think
probably the
Dune's
best casted TV or
eras I've ever
film
seen.
ever.
Yeah.
It's insane. Every time I watch it, I kind of like, oh, hold on a minute.
20
It's
years
him.
later, it's like, wait, is that Stephen Graham in one scene in one episode? Is that
Yeah,
Simon Pegg standing behind David Schwimmer for 2
it's
minutes?
crazy. Every time you watch it throughout the years and someone new comes about, you kind of it's like I didn't realize Tom Hardy was in every single episode. It's just you don't clock on these things until an actor
Decades.
blows up, and it has been that case for years. So yeah, big
And
shout
I
out to the
do
casting
think
director on Band of Brothers.
I do think Masters of the Air is going to have that. I know that's an early prediction to say, but I think literally in the last 2.5 years since it filmed, the fact that Austin Butler's gone on to have the career he has, as well as Shooting Gatwa being cast as the Doctor and loads of others, Barry Keoghan as well. Masters of the Air, I think, is locked in for that for the near future. But yeah, from the research I've done, I couldn't find a single actor who is not in this film that declined a role, that passed on a role, that was
Yeah,
cast and had to leave. I have not been able to find anything. And if there is, please someone comment it. And this is normally a testament with the cast where certain directors, even Oppenheimer, you could argue the best cast film last year. You know, we don't know who's offered a role yet, but Rob Pattinson couldn't be in it. And Nolan sort of spoke about that inherently because he was involved to a degree of that becoming the film it was so soon. And I've been able to find nothing with Dune, which is great. And so many of the stories are literally a case of Denis Villeneuve liked this director and liked this actor and wanted this actor to be in Dune. He would ring the actor, say, will you be in the film? Rather than come and audition. Obviously, many of them did audition, as they would have had to have done. But it's really interesting, the approach to this, that it felt like when Denis Villeneuve rings, you don't not answer the phone. It's one of those type things where not maybe they were sitting and waiting, but Batista spoke about it. Batista was desperate to be in this film. Without knowing it, Denis Villeneuve rang him and offered him the role. And I love Batista. Listen, it's not just I'm a fan of wrestling, and I've said this before on videos. It's a weird thing to say, but it's weird to say I root for like actors that you might have never met, or they've got a presence you will never know anything about their real life. But there are some ones where you're just like, I just wish this person the fucking best, and I love to, you just love to see people do well. I have that for Batista, to make the jump from wrestling to acting, to be in films like Dune, to be working with directors like Denis Villeneuve, Shyamalan with Knock at the Cabin Door, to see him blossom, and I think not lose the status of wrestler. He'll never lose that because he is Batista. He is a Hall of Famer and all that sort of stuff. But Hollywood is treating Batista as an actor now, not a wrestler. And I think that's a fucking wildly excellent thing. And I don't want to get into the whole scene of Rock, Hogan, all the other type of stuff, but I fucking love Batista. And I know in part one, he's a very small role, and we're probably going to get a lot more of him in part two. But I just, again, love the fact Batista is in a fucking Dune film. And it was a case the director wanted to cast him in it. He approached him, and I know a clip went viral this week of Batista saying that he was asking Denis Villeneuve for acting tips, and he wasn't afraid to ask a director, which is kind of crazy if you think about some of the egos in Hollywood. There are some actors that don't think they need, to get tips off a director, but Clearly, it happens. I know it's a weird one to talk about Batista, but that's just the one that always jumps on because I absolutely love him. But with this cast, where do you stand with it? Because I'm not like a child saying, "Oh, who's miscast, who isn't." I look at every single actor, and I know we've had the advantage, right? We're talking about this later. We've read the book. You've read Messiah as well, so you know a few more of them what they're going to go on to do. I look at this and think, I don't think anybody has been not even remotely miscast. I cannot see somebody else playing any role on this screen, and I think
Yeah,
that's a testament to everything with this film.
yeah, I love the cast. I do love the cast. I have no qualms with the cast at all. I think it's brilliant. I think everyone who people were unhappy with in the first film because they're a limited screen time, I think they're going to be extremely happy with the second film. Like I said, the second film is extremely different to the first film, and now the politics have kind of been built on. There's additional characters that weren't in the first film at all that are going to be in this one, with some brilliant actors who are kind of on the up. And you got obviously Christopher Walken in the film, Florence Pugh, Zendaya will be in the film a lot more if they follow the book how they should. And there's different ways the characters change as well. It's not. I think everyone's gonna have an opportunity to shine. I think in the second film, I know there was pretty much no acting nominations for the first film, but the second film definitely has some potential there for some, especially best supporting. But Paul Atreides certainly has a lot more to do in this film. Like Oscar moments. There are
Yeah,
sections of this film where if Chalamet's on his A game, he could definitely throw his hand into the game for best actor next year. But I do feel like Austin Butler will be fantastic as Frey. I do feel like it's perfect casting. I didn't want to see him visually until I seen the film, so I was slightly annoyed that the photos kept on popping up everywhere. And yeah, I do feel like yeah, personally, again, there's another character that I think may potentially pop up at the end of the film that there is a rumor
there's
about,
a
and
murmur of a casting, isn't there? I've
there is
seen this
a
name.
murmur, and it is someone that I called initially when the I
You
can't
wanted to
say
play the princess, didn't you?
yes, but I
Yeah, I
also
know. I know
thought
who. I'm not going to say the name. I know who.
yeah, but I wanted her to play the princess, but I also feel like the other character who she's potentially going to play would also work. And again, I can't speak on it too much because you're getting into spoiler territory. And again, this second film is in the next film will be even insane, and there's just so much going on in my head thinking about what they're going to put in, how they're going to end it, and stuff like that. I've forgotten the question. I think it's the cast, but yeah, I love the cast top to bottom.
I want to just quickly talk about one that jumped out more than anything in this. Jason Momoa. Now, I'm not like a dick, like, oh, I can't stand Momoa. I really like Jason Momoa as an actor. I know he has a swoon of certain fans of a certain maybe age, gender, and demographic that people talk of, which is why Aquaman made $1 billion. I'm not going on the jokes on that, but he has natural charisma, right? And people love him for his long hair, his beard. And do you remember when people were like going insanely angry that he had to shave his beard for a film? The fact that Jason Momoa was willing to shave his beard for this film is that film. And that's a weird tangent to start going off, but him as Duncan, Idaho, is perfect. The logic of he is the greatest swordsman in, well, not obviously Westeros, that he was, I guess, until he got an infection, but being the greatest, I guess, swordsman in, it's not really a universe, is it? I don't know what you'd call it. Not Arrakis, because that's the planet, but I don't know if there's like let's say the Imperium for conversation's sake. It feels like his film, and this sounds really weird to say. You have certain films where you get a support actor come in, they do a great job, and they go. And by them going, that's only them getting killed. With Duncan, this he feels like a mentor to Paul, but also like a friend, like a brother that he's meant to be. And I think him and Gurney are two of the trickiest characters to do because they're so similar yet so completely different in their persona, in their ability. But underlying at their core, they are loyal to the House of Traders. They are loyal to the Duke and to that family and where the story is going to take them, where it does take them. And I think those two are two of the trickiest casting calls to do in this film. And I've always thought that because you could end up with the same actor twice. but they are completely different. And every time Momoa is on screen, it doesn't just feel like he's having the time of his life. When you get to the scene of the Sardaukar, and by the way, with the first time I mentioned them, massive shout out to the throat singing voice man who became a cultural icon online for the 2 years, to which his 30 seconds chanting. I don't know what the term is for how he sings or whatever, but everything about the Sardaukar in this film I absolutely adore. And it's almost like wrestling, right? That you build up a wrestler by him putting people over. You see him witness it in the flesh. You have the Emperor's Sword, the greatest army there ever is. They only need 3 legions of them to do the job better than an entire Harkonnen army. And Duncan Idaho basically wipes out all but 3 of them in his final farewell. Probably like a 20-25 man kill streak at this point if you're going for the old Call of Duty days. The way in which they shoot the action in this film, the shields, the whole blue into red, simplistically done in the opening of the film, just with the simple patting of the sword. One of the easiest things to bring an audience to understand the logic of these shields.
Yeah.
I love it, but this feels like Momoa's film. And the emotional crux, for me, is his death. It is the moment he sacrificed himself. And then he has the whole Undertaker moment where he just rips the sword out of his own body to continue killing more of them. And the slightest bit of detail, which is the sort of laser wobbling, indicating there's stuff going on. I love him in this. I think he steals the film. I know you did a great tweet recently about certain people will tweet an actor steals a film in the lead role. I agree. That's impossible. I don't understand people that say that. But to me, I look at this, and if someone says pick a cast member aside from Oscar Isaac's magnificent beard, which I could never grow in that power armor, it is Jason Momoa in this. Sorry, I just needed to talk about him. He deserved his own little segment there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he's fantastic in it. And like you said, Idaho and Gurney are extremely similar, but also extremely different. And they're both kind of they're the 2 heavyweight kind of hitters protecting in the family. And they both seem to go about their job in completely different ways. And I do feel like the journey that both characters go on in the book and in the films is going to be a joy to see. And I am intrigued to see how they, again, there's so many complex things that happen in the second part of the book and in the second book that anything I could say could be spoiler territory. But I do feel like both characters and both actors are going to have a lot of stuff to chew on, and hopefully, hopefully continue the good run of acting that they've been doing, because I've been a big fan of Momoa, even though I haven't been a big fan of a lot of his films. He seems to be a shining light on some of the awful scripts that he picks. And it annoys me. Yeah, it absolutely pisses me off so much. It just doesn't work out at all and looks like that. It's insane.
No, definitely. I mean, we've spoken about characters, but we could people could do podcasts on these characters. We don't have the time for that, but we've got to talk about somebody that feels like a character. And this is, to me, at its core, original sci-fi. You want something new, you want something original, you need something instantly iconic, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to hype it to be. I cannot understate the importance of a soundtrack. It sounds horrible to say IP because I'm not looking at it from a studio perspective. In an original science fiction film, I do not want a carbon copy John Williams score. It has been done. He's the greatest ever to have done it. Thank you very much. Dune, we don't need to be the Star Wars orchestral. You bring in Hans Zimmer, who I've said on record, my favorite composer. Yes, I've seen him live many times. People have bored of me saying. I remember this as one of the moments, not that I took Dune seriously, but it was the announcement that no, Hans Zimmer is not going to be scoring Chris Nolan's new film. I was literally sat there like, what? Like, furiously, like, what? Like, what on earth happened here? And for those that don't know, Hans Zimmer was involved on Dune as far back as Denis Villeneuve. When they were doing post-production on Blade Runner 2049, Hans Zimmer, I think, claims that he convinced Denis to do Dune, which, from everything else, sounds like Denis didn't need convincing. But he made sure that he would, to be the one to do Dune, had the opportunity come. Then Hans Zimmer's presented the opportunity to do Tenet soundtrack or Dunes, and he opted to do Dune, with it being supposedly one of his favourite books growing up. And like Denis Villeneuve, he knew if you say no, you've missed your opportunity. And listen, my music knowledge is dreadful, but if this is one of your favourite books and it's about to become a franchise, you are going to create the not the voice but the noise of that film, the identity that comes through the music. And again, I don't know enough about soundtracks to talk about the right type of things people want to hear about, but the moment the film begins, it is the drums of Hans Zimmer. Before this film came out, they did a big trailer event. I remember Charlie covered it for us on the channel, and everyone was talking about the Hans Zimmer score. And like Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve wants his composers brought in as early as possible. Chris Nolan will bring them in on pre-production to help them do the film, as obviously Denis Villeneuve did with this. We also have to thank Hans Zimmer for declining Tenet, because that's led to us getting a Ludwig Göransson back-to-back and two unbelievable scores with Christopher Nolan, setting up a whole new era. And what I'm curious for the story is, it's not been reported anywhere, but did Hans Zimmer get offered Oppenheimer? Or did he not? We'll never know. I think he was doing Dune Part 2 anyway, but I do wonder moving forward if Christopher Nolan, not to do a Wally Pfister comparison like with Hoyt van Hoytma, but Nolan switched his DP and he's not gone back since. And I do wonder, could that be a thing moving forward with his scores with Ludwig Göransson, especially post Oppenheimer? Completely relevant to this discussion, but the Hans Zimmer Dune soundtrack is one of the greatest soundtracks I've listened to in my life. Yes, I'm biased, he's my favorite composer, but I want to talk about something even more insane. He released 3 soundtracks for this film. And for those unfamiliar with this is not normal. He has the normal, I'll say a bog standard. He has the score like what we all expect, an unbelievable score. He then composed Dune the Sketchbook, which is a combination of tracks used in the film, of course, but almost extended themes. So there's a House Atreides theme, which is like 16 minutes long. And if anyone's not listened to it, it's almost an experimental album. It's very different. There's stuff there that are in the main score, but there's stuff that isn't, and stuff that was in such a wild tangent. We never heard anything like it. And it's really hard to sort of talk about that score because it's not clear what it is. It's a sketchbook, right? That's the logic. It's a plan. It's not the fully finished thing, but there's a lot of the fully finished stuff in there. Not only does he then release that, he then releases a third soundtrack for you to listen to, which is for you to listen to whilst reading The Art of Dune Part 1. If anyone hasn't picked up behind the scenes, but it's magnificent. It's got all the concept art. It's got interviews with the production designers, the costume designers, Denis Villeneuve, of course, everybody involved from a creative standpoint. The fact a soundtrack was released for you to listen to whilst reading a book is absurd, and it works so well. It works unbelievably well. Each song, I think there's like 8 to 10 songs, and each one is a chapter of the book to be reading whilst listening to. But what this does to me as a fan of his work and as a fan of this film, it enhances everything about it. That their approach day one wasn't this generic, let's just go make a film. It was, this is going to be an experience and a project like no other before. And I don't think Hans Zimmer has ever approached a film such as this. I have heard murmurs of his score for part 2, as in not listened to the score, but there were descriptions of new instruments being created. Like, when I say that tall, apparently like dozens of feet tall. I don't know how, and I don't know if that's real, but my excitement for part 2 also lies at what on earth we're going to get with his soundtrack, because of his total dedication has been this. Every film he's scored, by the way, since Dune Part 1, he's come in post-production. He's not been involved in any of the score in pre-production by the 2 Dunes back-to-back. And I know I've just gone on a whole monologue about how great his soundtrack is. Only his second Oscar win, which is an absolute crime. Yet he won it on a live tour, which is pretty fucking sick. You cannot deny.
No, Hans Zimmer, what an absolute G with an orchestra. And I do feel like it is strange the way some things work. And you said about the score for Oppenheimer, which is probably going to go and win an Academy Award this year. So it is funny the way it works sometimes, and the way filmmakers, because look, there's a lot of filmmakers. Tarantino was working with Sally Menke before she passed away on every single film. The same producers, you find that they were working with the Weinsteins before the Harvey Weinstein stuff come out. There's just a familiarity with people that it just helps you get the film that you want. And I do sometimes wonder with filmmakers that they should experiment a little bit more. And maybe if pushing the boundaries might give us something completely different. And there's a reason why a lot of filmmakers, you can kind of tell, and they've got a direct stamp on their films. I think sometimes we give directors a little bit too much credit for a director's film. And, this clearly a Fincher film, or it's clearly a Tarantino film. Yes, of course, because it has their Tarantino films feel like Tarantino films because of the music, because of the writing, because of the directing, because of the vulgarness, because of the violence. There's so many different things that combine in to make them what they are. Whereas Denis Villeneuve, his films don't have that for me. What they have is amazing cinematography, amazing sound, amazing editing, amazing scripts, but it's not similar. Each film, Blade Runner and Dune Part 1 are completely different. Enemy and Ascendies are just completely different films. You can tell that they have certain traits because they're very cinematic. They're very wide angled lens. They're films that have cinematic feels, but also extremely human parts to them. And the story at its core is very humanized, but set in an extremely graphical world. And Hans Zimmer on this film just encompasses what you want with a sci-fi epic. And yeah, I agree. Hans Zimmer seems to be getting a little bit of hate
Yeah,
recently on the timeline, and I don't get that at all. Slightly a bit baffled about that, and it seems to happen with everyone that has a certain extent of fame and notoriety. They always seem to they love you until they hate you is what they say. And yeah, I'm extremely happy with the score for part one and can't wait to see what they do with part two, because that's the thing, you don't want it to be exactly the same, but you also don't want it to be completely different. And that's why it's hard. I know you said you talk about John Williams all the time, but when we're talking about epic films, it's hard not to bring up John Williams and
yeah,
having the core themes there, but being able to differentiate between different locations, different environments, different tempos of pace of the film. There's so much that comes into it when doing a score. And Hans Zimmer being there from early doors in the creation of the film, it just says a lot because he obviously had an idea of how he wanted the film to sound. And having conversations with Denis, they've worked out how they want it to look, how they want it to sound. And getting back to that part of they've brought in everyone behind the camera first. There's a clear idea of a film they wanted to make. This isn't stitched together by Tom, Dick, and Harry. This isn't a producer for Warner Brothers coming over and saying, look, you need to do this, you need to do that. No, they're pretty much giving Denny free reign at this point to get involved who he wants. And when you're bringing in people like Hans Zimmer, Greg Fraser, and a cast as stacked as this, it gives you the feasibility to kind of do what you want. And I think that's a brilliant thing.
no, I'm kind of with you, and I'm with you on the Hans Zimmer. I know I'm a fan, but I saw some weird tweets recently. Was like Hans Zimmer can never do what Ludwig Göransson does, and I'm like, worship the pair of them because the pair of them are unbelievable composers, and one of them has been at that level for 30 plus years.
Yeah, it's a
And
weird thing to do. We just want to compare all the time. It's this person's better than
yeah,
that. That person's better than this. This film's better than the sequel. We don't- Just starting enjoying things for what they are, and that's one of the reasons why award season drives me absolutely insane.
yeah,
Everyone just gets too on their high horse, and it's just a matter of opinions. Everyone seems to just driving themselves insane. Oh, this is better than this. But
they
okay,
start
is it?
dragging
Is it
down people who have done well to prove a point,
exact?
and the
Exactly
kind of
that.
not massively off tangent, but I saw the Iron Claw recently, loved it, unbelievable film. I also watched American Fiction recently, absolutely loved that film too. And I sat there like, I wouldn't take Jeffrey Wright out of the Best Actor nominations to put Zac Efron in. They are both two of the best performances of 2023 going off the American calendar. But there's not only five good performances in a year. Sometimes there's six, sometimes there's eight, sometimes there's 10. And that's the way it went. And it is interesting that you see, especially with the whole Barbie debacle of anyone that I've spoke to that says Margot Robbie should be nominated for Best Actress. I say, well, tell me who do you take out then? Okay, obviously Annette Bening. Um, but I then say, okay, well, what about Past Lives? What about Greta Lee? And oh, who'd you take out for Best Director? And once you start asking that, you don't get the responses that you should have. But yeah, very different tangent. But no, maybe it's not a different tangent. Let's talk some Oscars, Reece. Before we get to the end, we're going to round out. We'll talk the Oscars. We're going to talk box office very briefly. Apologies, I've realised the time how long I've been going. Um, you mentioned earlier, this one was nominated for 10 Oscars. And I remember this. We do the Oscars each year on the channel. We do the nominations. We do the live stream. I cannot fathom going off our 1 hour 20 minutes so far tonight. We spoke. I'd say a third of this conversation has been on Denis Villeneuve. Quite comfortably, one of the biggest snubs of my lifetime following award season, and it's a nomination. Okay, fine. How he was not able to be nominated for Best Director, I believe Dune had the most nominations that year. I could be wrong. It would then go on
Power of the Dog
second
had the
most.
most.
Okay, and I understand that was always winning Best Director. It then won 6 Oscars, which may have been the most that year, all technical ones. And I remember sat there fuming on the stream, like how can you not only nominate and reward these other individuals? We mentioned Hans Zimmer. I think it won. Did it win cinematography, sound, visual effects, soundtrack? Oh God, production design and costumes. Maybe I'm guessing in my head. I've not got the page up, but
it won
it was the technicals.
Yeah, it won score. It won sound, production design, cinematography, and editing, and also best visual effects.
Okay, so I got 5 out of the 6. That's good. That's a good pub question one day. And I'm there like, how can you not? And again, I understand. This is where we spoke about Oscars earlier. When they didn't nominate him for part 1, in my head, this is like football, right? It's always political, these shows sometimes. Even if you don't want to hear it, sometimes it can be. In my head, it's, okay, part 2, bring it home. There's already been 2 Lord of the Rings comparisons. Lord of the Rings sweeps everything Return of the King. I'm not going to drag Return of the King down, but I always do say that is one of the weakest Oscar years. If people do genuinely have a look, I think Lost in Translation was the only other big one. And that's nothing against Return of the King. It's the best film that should have picked up those awards, rightfully so. I cannot fathom still Denis not being nominated for this. And it's frustrating still looking back, because we're looking back only 2 years later. And, like we said, part 2 is about to come out. I hope in 2 years' time or 4 years' time, whenever Messiah's coming out, we're not angrily saying the same thing. How did part 2 get all these nominations but not director, let alone a win at this point? And again, it's not all about winning, but and as I've got older, this is where I've enjoyed awards season more. Not the bravado with it. It's the peers recognizing each other. And I think if you look at the speeches, you look at the industry, some of the actors or the directors that don't necessarily enjoy the public attention, it means a lot more to them to be recognized by those within their industry than anybody outside of it. And I think that's massively underrated. I think there's a video, timing-wise, Christopher Nolan got a bit emotional with the DGAs, basically saying that the fact his director peers picked him as the best director of that year meant more to him than anything else. And that's
that's why I find it weird that he would get a DGA award and not be nominated for best director. But look, it is fair to say that a lot of directors do get kind of passed by on this award at the Oscars if they do box office related blockbuster type of films. Christopher Nolan didn't get a nomination for The Dark Knight. Barbie, Greta Gerwig didn't get one this year for Barbie. Denis Villeneuve didn't get one for Dune Part 1. There is a kind of stigma towards direction and these blockbuster films, and that is just the way that it is. And I find it insane that the only reason why there's a big uproar this year is because it's Greta Gerwig, and it's a film heavily criticizing the patriarchy, right? And that makes sense. But you only have to look 2 years ago when this film had 10 nominations and didn't get a best director, which I found
6 wins as well.
Really,
I mean, it's the guy that's what we spoke about. He's pulled all of those people in pre-production as well. That not well done, you hire the right people, but to me that's also disrespectful. Like, congratulations, you hired this composer who did that, you hired this editor that did that, you hired these VFX teams, you hired this cinematographer, you did all of this, but you know what, you're not good enough for this year. And to me, that's how I read that. And like I said, his time will come, and I'm excited when it does. And again, a lot of the Oscars, they look at it from a career perspective, and absolutely with his career, especially the last 10 years, the run he's again doing those films back to back to back to back to back is Spielberg-esque, and that doesn't happen. I don't even think Spielberg did 5 films in 5 years. I could be wrong. He probably
problem with me, the biggest thing with the snub for me, and I think that is a snub, right? Because I look at this year's lineup, and
it is 100% a snub.
I don't see who you'd remove this year's 5 to put in Greta Gerwig. Yeah. But I look at, pardon me, I look at 2021 and Kenneth Branagh for Belfast, see you later, goodbye. Steven Spielberg for West Side Story, again, see you later, goodbye. Paul Thomas Anderson, Licorice Pizza, one of my favourite directors, see you later, goodbye. The only person I wouldn't have put him in for, the 2, is Jane Campion and Ryusuke Hamaguchi for The Power of the Dog and Drive My Car. I do feel like Jane Campion, rightly so, won the award um, for The Power of the Dog, but I do feel like Denis should have had a nomination. And again, I do feel like it is a hindrance to be directing a blockbuster film where the focus is a lot on the theatrical side and the money that the film makes rather than the acting. And I do feel like one of the reasons why people are a little bit more bringing up Greta this year is because of the America Ferrera nomination, the Ryan Gosling nomination, the Margot Robbie omission, which, yes, that is a snub, 100%. She should have been nominated.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned financials. Let's talk some because this film grossed $400 million, and people might be wondering, "Oh, that's not as high as they would hype up normally." During a pandemic, of a budget of $165 million, to a film that was subsequently released online at the exact same moment that went into a cinema for anyone to watch. It doesn't matter if you're a casual fan or not. If that is accessible to get on a torrent website on day one, there will be people, regardless of their thoughts on the film, that torrent it, download it, that share it around. There will be people that might have wanted to watch this film 4 times at the cinema and they paid for it once and torrented it 3 times. Now, not me. I think I saw it 5 or 6 times in IMAX, and I was very snobby about seeing it in IMAX too. Although the Cineworld limited screening wasn't, which still pissed me off. But I'd already seen it at that point. Anyway, for those unfamiliar with the day and date releases, this is obviously the whole Warner Brothers. This is the beginning of, not even beginning of Warner Brothers problems, but this is one of their many problems, was announcing that every film for a calendar year would go online the same moment it goes into cinemas, wiped out their box office and contributed to the downward spiral they are still spiraling down quicker and quicker and quicker as every passing day goes that David Zaslav is in charge. The fact that Dune would gross $400 million is astounding that year. Even Godzilla vs. Kong, to its credit, I think that grossed $600 million that year. I think that was in cinemas after it went online, but that was a different type of online. It wasn't on HBO Max. I believe it was a premium paid for. I could be wrong. Someone can correct me. But this was the only one that had the HBO Max same moment, which those outside of America, it's not available here. It was in America, the biggest territory where people would have gone. And you're looking at films like Wonka getting $500 million. It's become Timothée Chalamet's highest grossing film of his career. No, it's not. Interstellar is, but people forget he's in that. Highest grossing lead, I guess they have to say it now. It's really interesting that Dune did so well. And there's no coincidence that its opening weekend opening weekend, the announcement came that Dune Part 2 is greenlit. It's going to happen. Most films that did the day and day release ended up being catastrophic losses at the box office. They weren't grossing 400 mil. Some were lucky to get to 100, 200, but arguably the biggest film they had go on there to get 400 mil. I believe a very high percentage being IMAX screenings too. Yeah. Also shows to the filmmakers into the industry that it wasn't just people going out to watch this at the cinema. It wasn't just them going out to see it at an IMAX. It was they wanted to experience this film in the way it should be experienced. And I do think that's why Denis has done Part 2 fully in IMAX ratio, that he knows the audience is there that will be going to the IMAX to watch it, and he's rewarding them as well as giving other audiences the opportunity to do it. It shouldn't just fall on Christopher Nolan to get people to go to shoot an IMAX, and that's what I've seen more of recently. By getting other filmmakers, and I think James Cameron, don't say any more about what he does for technology and the cinematic experience, but there's not enough directors doing so, and I think hopefully with Oppenheimer, I think it does feel like one of the big films where people will talk about what that did. Barbie, of course, same day Barbenheimer, but that premium format that's been milked to death, I think it needs someone else other than Christopher Nolan to sort of get other filmmakers shooting on those cameras. Zack Snyder shooting on IMAX cameras to release a film on Netflix? Absolutely not. Get out the door. Why are you being lent those cameras? But Denis, he's going to shoot on IMAX, let you watch it IMAX, opening day, great. Be it for IMAX like Oppenheimer has Dune Part 2 showing on loop for its opening weekend. You want to watch it 12 a.m., 4 a.m., 8 a.m., 12 a.m., whatever it's going to be, Dune's on loop like the others. And it's insane. And most of them sold out on day one, by the way. Almost no seats left. And if they are, they're right at the front, which I wouldn't want to sit the BFI IMAX. But someone does. So fair play to them. But sorry to go on a weird box office tangent. I know not everyone likes box offices, but when you're looking at a film like this,
yeah, you have to. You have to. And there's so many things. Exactly. There's so many things.
There's no financial numbers, then we don't get Part 2. It's some people are like, we shouldn't judge films on box office. I'd love to agree with you, but it is also a business. You have not judge the quality of the film, but you have to judge its metrics. You have to look at what studios will do. If a film outperforms, if there is a formula that works, let's take the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of course every other franchise is going to do a cinematic universe. And they'll all experience themselves why theirs are failing because it wasn't done properly, and why the key would go on to fail eventually too. Not fail, but decline. And this is what studios and networks need. Box office to me is as important a discussion as the film and the accolades that come with it. It's not the be all and end all. Beautiful amount of films have been box office bombs. They've also had some terrible films that are grossing billions, so it evens out.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I do feel like the day and day release is going to have an effect. It ended up being the ninth highest streaming film of 2021. And again, you look at the box office numbers and, I made 400 mil. And it's like, okay, but how much did it make when you add on the VOD sales? How much did it make when you add on the DVD and Blu ray sales? You look at box office, and yes, box office is a major thing. But in this day of streaming and kind of repeat viewings, it's not the be all and end all. And I do feel like sometimes people get a little bit too um, in their minds about box office and budgets, and really need to understand the complexities that come with it, because the box office budget, and yes, it had a budget of 165, but it probably spent another 150 million on marketing.
Yeah,
It's like it's not. Doom Part One, for me, I don't think it was a financial success. I think it done enough to get Part Two greenlit, and it made enough noise on the reviews, and it made enough noise with the awards that it made sense to make Part Two. If this film didn't get no Oscar nominations and it got absolutely torn down by the critics, we probably wouldn't get a Part Two based on the amount of money that it made. And there's a lot of factors that come into sequels, prequels, shared universes being made. And I think everyone needs to look at all the factors that come into this. And again, during a COVID period, it done okay. I expect part two to do so much better.
I'm very
So much better.
curious. This is my big enigma is that you kind of mentioned it. It wasn't a hit. I think this the law of averages, right? You meant to just double the budget, aren't you? And I think some say, "Oh, double it and a little bit more," but I think this is on more of a breaking even. It's not a hit. It's not a loss. It's neutral ground. Then they look at, okay, we did it online, which completely fucked up. I'd say a minimum that's an extra $100 million if I'm being really honest. Like stuff like that. It's been shown as failing, and again, as you mentioned, the Oscars and the critics. There is no way, and that's a big thing for a studio. The longevity of a studio, having greenlit this classic film 20 years ago, that's a draw 20 years later. And they'll look at the accolades. And if this bombs and it's done zero nominations, it's okay, no one cares about what's that dreadful one, the popcorn award or whatever, the one Razzies, that's the one. Not
The
that people
Razzie
care about, but
Awards.
if it didn't do well on streaming, if it didn't do well financially, and if it didn't do well at accolades, yeah, we're not getting part two. And a lot of the actors will never talk about Dune again. But thankfully, it's not, because we have it to thank for an incredible director, cast, every person involved, and kind of sticking with this. But heading into sort of final thoughts, I mean, actually, not that we're going to like scenes by scene breakdowns, but do you have without putting you on the spot, we spoke about how incredible this whole film is. Do you have one thing in particular that jumps out you'd want to chat about briefly before we do final thoughts? I know we've been going almost 2 hours, which is insane. I didn't think we were going, so I'm not going to lie.
No, not really. I think we've kind of covered everything that we need to cover with the film. Just need to reiterate that part two is going to be extremely better than part one, even though I thought part one was fantastic. And the ideas of part one from other people are going to change when part two comes out. And I hope it does extremely well. I hope we get Doom Messiah adapted as well. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to Doom Part 2. It was my most anticipated film last year, and when it got delayed, it's my most anticipated film probably this year with Furiosa. I can't wait for that one. But with Part 1, I think it's going to see people appreciate it extremely much more as time goes on.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you, and that's where I stand with. I think part one is the big. I know it was actually marked as the beginning, wasn't it? But it does feel like the beginning of potentially, without staying the pot, to be one of the greatest trilogies ever made. Who knows? But I do think, based off the success of part one, it has the potential, and we wouldn't be here talking about this without the film successes, without the directors, the people involved, and absolutely love it. And I think to people that will be watching this, Dune's built a devout fan base. I know that there are older generations that have read the books, that have grown up with it, and are big parts of it. But it does open the doors for new and future generations to find out this, like Lord of the Rings, like Batman, like any franchise, like James Bond. if you build a successful foundation, people will come to it as time goes by. And I think Dune absolutely has that. And when we look back at Denis Villeneuve's career, this is going to be, I think, the real big talking point of that career. Without understating what he could go on to do, what he's already done, it does feel like this is the film, this is the project that his career has built toward. And I think that's what kind of makes it so much more exciting. But that is going to do it for this discussion. I mentioned how long we've been going. Anybody that's watching, thank you so much for watching up to this point. And please do comment your thoughts if you haven't already. I mentioned already about a lot of other Dune videos. A Dune Part 2 review next Wednesday, a 1984 the week after, and then a very probably ending up being a long spoiler discussion after Part 2 releases, so we give everyone the opportunity to watch it in the opening week. Reece, I'm handing over to you. I don't have your socials on the screen, but even on so many of my videos, when I talk about grafters online that I know or speak to, I'm not just blowing smoke, but you run multiple podcasts, a YouTube channel, writing as well. Where can the people find you? What else are you up to, and what can you talk about? I know you did the big horror list recently, which we joked about because I've only seen like 10 horror films my entire life. But yes, the floor is yours, as we'd say.
So there is a link tree on my Twitter, which is probably the best place to find me anyway. It's at reospositivepov. Reos is REOS positive POV, the normal way. And you can find a link to the 2 podcasts that I do, the YouTube channel, the website that I run, that I also write for. And yeah, anything that I'm doing will be up on there. I've got nothing really bubbling right this minute. I do have some personal stuff that I'm currently sorting out. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, there'll be a lot more things in the pipeline. And yeah, I'm mainly intrigued to watch Dune Part 2. That's the biggest thing on my horizon, that's for sure.
Definitely. I think that'll be the same for a lot of other people. And as always, to people that are watching, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to Reece's channel, follow him. Genuinely, some of the best Twitter stuff, especially when you're talking with other film fans. It's always amazing to do so. So thank you for taking time out of your evening to join me for this. Thank God it's 2 of us, not 3 of us. God knows how much longer that would be. But that's going to be this night. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.